Hello everyone, welcome to CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. This is our 4th episode, and this one is on, as you can see, Global Warming Unmasked, the Hidden Agenda. We have, as usual, put hundreds and hundreds of research hours into this, and I'll tell you, as usual, there is no way all of that information is going to get in a show like this. Now, it's probably the case that many people simply haven't thought a lot of this through. They just say, oh, it's nice, we should recycle and, throw things away, and, you do all this nice green stuff, and that's nice and help the earth. That's fine. But there is a much larger agenda at work here. And many people, because their lives are busy, don't have a chance to think all this through and sit down and do 600, 500 hours of research. So that's what we're here for. There are 3 different goals here that the various agents of climate change have: population control, global governmental cooperation, and earth worship. These are 3 different crowds now, remember. They don't necessarily have much to do with each other, except they all fit nicely. This idea of global warming and climate change fits the agenda for each of them to advance their own agendas. Now, they don't care about the others, but like we said, they dovetail together very nicely. They're all intertwined with each other. The shortest route to achieving each of their individual goals is supporting the hysteria of global warming. So, as usual, we always start off with a thesis. What is our thesis for this show? Catholic leaders must recognize global warming for what it is. It is a government power grab via population reduction. It is a pseudoscience and hypersensationalism. These things are being used to promote the global warming agenda, just as they were in the early 20th century eugenics movement. Something that we discovered during this that is sort of a little-known fact to most Americans about our own history as a country. In fact, global warming is the evolution, the natural evolution of that early eugenics program. Now, before we get into the motives and the agenda behind the global warming scare, let's begin with what's passing itself off as science. Then, after that point, we're going to talk about how this science, which is really junk science, is being used to promote a very, very scary social engineering agenda. Let's look first at some of the key players behind the global warming gospel. Now, they're important because of their financial backing, and it is substantial. Their political power, their influence, their cultural influence, and their philosophical direction. People are behind this whole global warming movement, steering a course, and you're getting money and influence and culture and et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to visit some of these folks right now, and just picked up some of their quotes in no particular order. Here's the first one. John Holdren is the science czar and author of a book called Eco-Science. He's the science czar in the Obama administration. As you can see, he's the director of White House Office in Science and Technology Policy. He says, talking about global warming, climate change is coming at us faster with larger impacts and bigger risks than even most climate scientists expected as recently as a few years ago. So, be alarmed. The White House is telling you, be alarmed. Now, we're already experiencing anthropogenic interference. We'll get to that in a second. The real question now is whether we can still avoid catastrophic, notice the words, catastrophic anthropogenic interference in climate. He goes on to say, there is no guarantee that catastrophe can be avoided even if we start taking serious evasive action immediately. But if we wait even one more decade before starting, the chance of avoiding catastrophe will get very much smaller. John Holdren made these comments as part of his PowerPoint presentation at a 2006 conference of the SES, which is the Distinguished Science Seminar, and that particular conference or seminar was titled Meeting the Climate Change Challenge. Now, if you don't know who John Holdren is, you know who this guy is. Bill Gates says, the world must eliminate all of its carbon emissions and cut energy costs in half in order to prevent a climate catastrophe. Notice how that word keeps coming up, catastrophe, which will hit the world's poor hardest. We have to drive full speed and get a miracle in a pretty tight timeline. Of course, no discussion of climate change would be complete without the now discredited poster boy of global warming himself, Al Gore, in his 2006 Academy Award-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, because Hollywood, of course, goes right along with this. Al Gore says the following: the climate crisis is indeed extremely dangerous. In fact, it is a true planetary emergency. And again, the voluminous evidence now strongly suggests that unless we act boldly and quickly to deal with the underlying causes of global warming, our world will undergo a string of terrible catastrophes. Favorite word. Now, he also says, 2,000 scientists in 100 countries working for more than 20 years in the most elaborate and well-organized scientific collaboration in the history of humankind have forged an exceptionally strong consensus that all the nations on Earth must work together to solve the crisis of global warming. Another global warming apostle, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, he's president of the IPCC. The IPCC is a United Nations body, intergovernmental panel on climate change. He's the top dog at the UN on this topic. He says we should be prepared for the worst because these temperature extremes will continue. Now, again, as a quick aside, to show you how the media has climbed on board with this whole thing about global warming, when they have somebody in their presence, they have to bolster the credentials of these people when they're talking. So Dr. Rajendra Pachauri is touted by the media as the world's top climate scientist. I worked in media, as many of you know, for a good number of years, and something that happens in the course of writing stories is you start to kind of stick in adjectives in front of nouns that just sort of become just part of the person's name almost. So whenever you hear about Pachauri, you can go look him up. You'll always see somewhere in the article, the world's top climate scientist, Rajendra Pachauri, as though this kind of embeds in your mind that this is who this guy is. It's actually kind of funny because in reality, the world's top climate scientist isn't a scientist at all. He actually was a former railway engineer, and he holds a PhD in economics. He has no science background at all, but he's the world's top climate scientist. Now, the media continually attributes that title to him. Another personality that we'll all recognize, Ted Turner. Of course, we all know his scientific credentials. Ted Turner said, we'll be 8 degrees hotter in not 10, but 30 or 40 years. And basically, none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Yeah, that's what we thought too. So how real a threat is this? Could all of these famous people with all these degrees and all this knowledge and all this study, could they all be wrong about this? When people talk about global warming, you have to make a very, very, very important distinction here. There are 2 different types. There's natural climate variability, meaning the Earth's temperatures just go up and down of their own accord, as they have for billions, whatever, how many years. Anthropogenic global warming, anthro, of course, meaning man, means that it's man-made global warming. So the Earth would just be a happy, wonderful place if it weren't for us horrible, miserable human beings polluting the environment. The Earth's temperature changes naturally. Sometimes it's colder, other times it's warmer. The Ice Age, as we all know, is a good example of that. When people today talk about global warming, many are not referring to just the Earth doing it in its own accord. They're talking about this horrible carbon dioxide emissions, CO2, and that man, because man produces this in his industry and just being on the planet, breathing out, all of this stuff is a result of man. So the glaciers are melting and the whole world is going to hell because of that horrible creature, man. The leading scientific group making the most notable claims is, as we said earlier, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Now understand, this is the group at the UN. These are the promoters of the theory of man-made climate change due to CO2. Understand, when a pollutant goes into the air, there are all kinds of different pollutants that make into the atmosphere. CO2 is not a pollutant. It is a naturally occurring substance in nature. Everybody in here right now is emitting CO2 by the virtue of the fact that you're breathing. This is what we do. That's why it always gets hot and stuffy in a room after a while, because everybody's CO2ing all around the place. It is not a pollutant. However, in a case that went before the Supreme Court a few years ago, the Supreme Court ruled sided with this is why it's important how you vote. CO2 was ruled as a pollutant by the U.S. Supreme Court. That transfers power to the EPA and all sorts of government bodies to now go around and try to start regulating it. Because it is a pollutant, it falls under the EPA charge, and now they start to pollute. There's some court cases going on about this, but you get the point. They're trying to make naturally occurring things fall under their purview as government, so government can now start regulating those sorts of things. Now, the IPCC is the driving force behind the theory of man-made global warming. You got to remember that. This agency, everything comes into it, everything goes out of it. Various scientists from around the world submit their studies and their reports to this UN organization, and then the organization determines which findings will be published. Doesn't publish them all. Doesn't say, oh, look, here's this big controversy. It cherry picks whichever ones it wants and says, oh, here, look at the picture. And then all of this scientific mumbo-jumbo gets translated, and you have Ted Turner sitting on there telling you we're going to be eating each other in 40 years. This organization shapes and molds these opinions and these studies in such a way as to support their theory. And it is a theory, and it is nothing else. Despite the engineered appearance of a broad consensus among scientists, there is no true consensus. Remember Al Gore's quote? Oh, all these scientists all over the world, the greatest thing, this major consensus. Well, Obama said a short while ago, made a speech, and in his speech he said, few challenges facing America and the world are more urgent than combating climate change. The science is beyond dispute, and the facts are clear. Well, that so ticked off every single scientist on this page that they took out an ad in the Chicago Tribune and said, no, I'll skip all their stuff. The last thing they said was, Mr. President, your characterization of scientific facts regarding climate change and the degree of certainty informing the scientific debate is simply incorrect. You got to be pretty inspired to take out an ad to say, sorry, Mr. President, but no thank you. Scientists who disagree with this reigning dogma within the scientific community on man-made climate change, they're stifled. Their contrary findings are not published. They make an active effort. The IPCC makes an active effort to not publish their work. They are marginalized. They don't receive government grants. They're not given honors or awards. They're not given promotions. They are muzzled and marginalized because they're going against, they're bucking the prevailing philosophy. The IPCC is focused on one point and one point only, that the planet is heating up and that man-made CO2, the output of that, is the only thing responsible for it. This is not science. This is not a scientific approach. All of us remember from grade school or early high school that science is always testing all these different theories, and then once you find one that you think fits, then everyone else gets to test it until you have some sort of scientific consensus that here's the problem, this seems to be the situation, we've reproduced our results everywhere, and every result that makes some kind of sense has had a chance to have its day and be heard. That's not what's going on here. It's not even close to what's going on here. Not only are the conclusions that the IPCC reach based on very, very, very shaky interpretation of the data, but no other conclusions are even considered. Conclusions that actually make more sense, not only in theory, but also in practical observational methods as well. Now, we're not going to get buried in all the science. I'm not a scientist. Most people don't like this stuff. They can't talk about it. But we want to give you one example. And there are thousands of examples and disputes within the scientific community. But we're going to give you one example. One very possible natural explanation for increased temperatures over the last 100 years. That has nothing to do with CO2 emissions at all, involves something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's called PDO for short. Now, very simply, it's just this. The PDO, the change in temperatures over the Pacific, is just a regional shift in weather patterns over the northern Pacific. That's it. Unlike the famous El Nino and La Nina, we've all heard of those, where the weather patterns change every 3 to 5 years, this has been charted to change roughly every 30 years. Now, we're going to show you a little something here. The Earth's temperature increased, look over one of our monitors here, the Earth's temperature, and you have to follow the white line, the Earth's temperature here increased. This is a chart from 1900 to 2000. And it generally charts the change of the Earth's temperature. And you can see from the early 1900s up until about 1940, the Earth's temperature slowly began to climb. Now, the global warming crowd says this is due to man's output of carbon. Well, that seems to make sense, at least on the face of it. This is sort of when the Industrial Revolution begins to take hold. Factories are spewing stuff into the air. There's no regulations. The stuff going out is pretty thick. So it's like, oh, okay, you're starting to pollute the air and, the temperature's going up. Well, that seems to make sense right there. It seems to make sense. But if higher temperatures are directly attributable to man's increase in carbon output, then it would stand to reason that periods of greater carbon production would cause hotter temperatures. That's their point. More CO2 in the air, hotter temperatures. One equals the other. That's the whole argument. Now, let's look at this last century. Man produces carbon largely through industrialization. Each successive decade that goes by, industrialization increased, particularly during World War II, when every single country in the world practically was cranking out factories 24 hours a day and couldn't keep the shifts filled because there was so much work to do. So the temperature, you would expect, would increase because the CO2 emissions would have increased. Well, let's look what happened. Like we said, from about 1910 to the beginning of World War II, roughly 1940, the temperature increased. Then, from the 1940s to about the 1970s, it kind of stabilized and actually decreased a little. How's that possible? Wait a second, did we close the factories down in 1940? 1945, look, this goes down like this, so it decreases slightly. Then, over the next 30 years, it roughly warmed up again, and now we've been kind of on a downward slope or a plateau since then. Since 2000 to 2010, these last 10 years, the temperatures, like we said, have sort of stabilized. So the 20th century, if you were to kind of look at it as just one big chart, can sort of be roughly divided into three parts. A warming trend at the beginning, third, a sort of leveling off with a slight decrease in the middle third, and then another increase, which is now stabilized again. First third of the century is marked by relatively light industrialization, and the temperature increased. Then we see that industrialization really takes off here, and the temperature actually decreases slightly, which doesn't make sense with this correlation of more CO2, higher temperatures. All of a sudden right here, it's like something seems wrong with the theory. Then, as we take off from the 1970s, late 70s, they actually go up a little. Now, the global warming crowd has spent hundreds of millions of dollars of research money, most of it tax money, trying to explain this temperature difference here. In the middle of the 20th century, as greenhouse gases increased, the temperature actually decreases. Now, it's not a dramatic decrease, but it's significant because the theory is, remember, the more gas going in the air, the higher the temperatures go. More gas went in the air during this period than this period. So why is the temperature going down? Why isn't it skyrocketing right there as the whole industrialization really takes root? One logical explanation for this is the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which, as we can see from these graphs, and that's it here, as we can see here, sort of fits in nicely with this fluctuation of temperatures. When the weather patterns are in what we call a positive phase, the temperatures go up a little bit. When they're in a negative phase, the temperatures go down a little bit. And when it goes into a positive phase, the temperatures go up again. This happens at about every 30 years. Now, if you were to overlay these two things together, where you compare the positive and negative PDO to the temperatures, what do you see? Well, you see the temperatures going up just as this is happening, then they start to go down just as the negative phase happens, and then they start to go up again. This is at least worth considering, don't you think? Seems to be, well, makes sense. No, it's all you people breathing. You're causing it. Now, the point is, why is the IPCC, why is the United Nations refusing to look at this and even consider it? This is not a case of they looked at it, considered it, and then dismissed it. They refuse to let this into the conversation because they are hell-bent on proving that the only thing this can be is carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions. That's not science. It might be a scientist who's writing it, but he's not being scientific when he's doing it. The Earth's environment is immensely complicated. with innumerable variables and interrelationships that no one really understands. And we certainly don't understand them sufficiently to be able to predict worldwide impacts and catastrophes. Even in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're all going to be eating each other. Now, not that it's not a good thing to try and understand the planet. We, of course, need to be good stewards of creation when we do this. Our science has been given to us. Our ability to understand all of the world, the way the world works, has been given to us as a gift, and we need to explore this in the most ethical, truthful, honest fashion that we possibly can. The climate change crowd is saying that man-made carbon emissions are the cause to Earth's temperatures increasing, and it is causing them to increase to such a degree that Earth will not be able to recover without catastrophic impact. That's a claim, so it gets tested. Now, however, there's no more reason to believe that CO2 levels cause an increase in the Earth's temperatures than to just reverse that correlation and say, well, maybe as the Earth's temperatures go up, the CO2 levels go up too. Is that theory not worth testing? Because there seems to be some kind of correlation. If that's your point, well, then how do you know one's causing the other? You could just flip it around. All of these questions need examining, and it's unfair and unscientific to say, no, it's just this one theory we've latched onto. As one prominent author points out, the IPCC view is not based on any in-depth investigation of the role of nature in climate change. They have merely found mankind alone at the scene of the crime, and so mankind must be responsible for the crime. That's not science. That's assumptions. That's what you read in tabloids. That's written, by the way, by Roy Spencer, who wrote a wonderful book that's in our bibliography. And if you want to know more about this, we highly suggest it to you. The Great Global Warming Blunder. It's a very good book. It's very easy to understand. Those charts on the PDO actually were from his book. Now, many of the basic rules of science are simply discarded. Unproven assertions and assumptions rule the day. Those assumptions are then treated as facts and plugged into various theoretical models and computer-generated things. And all of a sudden, these formulas come out and say, oh, if you move this variable and that one and say this and that and move, shift around this, and all of a sudden, bam, catastrophe, we're eating each other in 30 years. All the while, credible scientists who challenge the assumptions with their own research and their own studies, which show much more reasonable theories, these people are dismissed, they're disregarded, they're ignored, they're made fun of, they're marginalized. They will not be admitted into the academy when it comes to the discussion. So in poker, we call this stacking the deck. The fix is in for global warming, and the fix is to prove, whether it's true or not, that man is the cause of Earth dramatically heating up. But many people are having none of this. They see behind all of this a politically driven agenda, and behind all the drum banging of eco-terrorism, they see a great big lie. The founder of the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel should know something about the climate. John Coleman says, global warming is the greatest scam in history. Pretty good comment. Thanks, John. Now, the argument could also be made, to build on what Coleman just said, that global warming is the most talked about issue in history. Is there anyone in America who has not heard this term? Global warming, it's in movies, it's in TV, it's in products, it's let's go green, everything. You know, you got to say, how did it get to be this way? How does everyone in America know about the results of this one isolated area of junk science and then it's applied to the entire culture? How did it happen? Some of the leading proponents of global warming are actually on record about that very question. Here's one. Unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. John Houghton, he's the first chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Here's another one. It doesn't matter what is true, it only matters what people believe is true. Paul Watson, Mr. Greenpeace himself. Yeah. The only way to get our society to truly change is to frighten people with the possibility of a catastrophe. That is by Professor Emeritus at UC Santa Barbara. Look at these people. They're leading people in this field, saying, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, just say it. Frighten people, scare them, just get them to move, get them moving. This sort of agenda-driven thinking has been largely corralled into the IPCC. From here, scientific reports based on all of this questionable research get put together. They put them into press releases. They call press conferences to announce to the world yet another man-made disaster is going to happen. The Himalayas are going to melt in 10 years and all the snow. The polar bear is going to be drowning. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is not a scientific organization. It calls itself that, but it's not. It's a political advocacy group that dresses itself up as a scientific body, all the while defying the basic tenets of scientific inquiry by selectively accepting some experimental results and refusing to acknowledge a whole lot of others. It's latched on to this theory about CO2 emissions produced by man, and they're saying that's the culprit of everything that's wrong with the planet. This theory serves as a perfect springboard for the leadership of the IPCC. The leadership of the IPCC, I'm not talking about many of the scientists who are out working in the field and kind of going through this and just sending their reports in for fair analysis. We're talking about the leaders of this, the people who sit in the offices. The leadership has allied with various groups whose agendas dovetail all very nicely with this under the banner of global warming. The goal of these groups, and this is it, is population control, global governmental cooperation, and the promotion of earth worship as a new religion. 3 different groups, don't really have an awful lot to do with each other per se, but they all fit nicely under this banner of global warming. What are these groups, along with others who innocently think that being green is just the right thing to do? What do they stand to gain? Well, the first thing is money, and lots of it. The money that this climate change scare has generated is absolutely astounding. There are rivers of cash, green cash, flowing into the green technologies and alternative energies and climate research and all of that. Most of it's your tax money. For one example, in 2009 alone, HSBC Bank estimates that $94 billion was spent on green stimulus globally. $94 billion. And where's it all coming from? Mostly governments, but not all. It's coming from corporations, it's coming from Hollywood celebrities, banks, charitable foundations, retirement funds, churches, which we'll get into a little bit later. Everyone is investing their money in this cause. Now, we could spend hours talking about the money trail. That's a whole separate show. You know, we do those shows really well when we follow the money, but we don't have time for this one. Instead, we encourage you again, check it all out on this bibliography. Look it up. We have all of the information here, all the names of the groups, the year by years, what they've given, everything. It's astounding the amount of money that has gone into this. What else does the leadership of the IPCC get out of this? Well, not only money, which they get a lot of, they also get prestige. How much prestige? Well, they won a Nobel Prize. They won a Nobel Prize along with Al Gore in 2007. Won a Nobel Prize. What did they win it for? For their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change. We don't know it's man-made. So how are you handing out awards for this? The measures that are needed to do this counteract such a change. Gore, as the poster boy for the whole green movement, made a very interesting comment in his book, Earth in the Balance. The fate of mankind, as well as of religion, depends upon the emergence of a new faith in the future. Armed with such a faith, we might find it possible to, and notice the word, re-sanctify the earth. Now, he's not alone. Many others also support a type of exaltation of the earth or nature, treating nature as almost as if it's a personal being. As a matter of fact, they treat it as though it is a personal being. It amounts to a worship of creation over the Creator. This is where the IPCC is also important. The unsubstantiated scientific conclusions that pour out of their headquarters as though it's gospel is the perfect ammunition for each of these 3 groups. Global warming has made each of them, the population control crowd, government, global governance people, and earth worshipers, all become natural allies under the banner of global warming. They push the global warming agenda because it serves their specific agendas, each one of them. So, now we're going to take a look at each one of these 3 groups and their agendas and their methods and how global warming helps advance them. First, the population control crowd. For most of the population control crowd, Their first job, their first task is convincing people that climate change hysteria is justified, that this is real, and we have to convince people of that. John Holdren, Obama's science czar again, he says this: lower is better for lots of reasons. Now, I want you to hold on for a second here. Remember what he was saying first. Look at the way these people construct their arguments. Earth is warming up. Man-made CO2 is responsible for that. Problem, cause, now we get into the fix. Lower is better for lots of reasons. 8 billion people in 2100 is preferable by far to 10 billion. Says who? Reduced growth can be achieved by measures that are attractive in their own right. And look at what his reduced growth methods are: education, opportunity, health care, reproductive rights for women. Ring a bell. Bill Gates, remember the same thing. Oh, world's horrible. Oh, it's got to reduce these carbon emissions by half. Oh, what does he say? How do we do that? The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. If we do a really great job on vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 to 15%. 10 to 15% less humans on the planet. Al Gore. Third world nations are producing too many children too fast. It is time to ignore the controversy over family planning and cut out of control population growth. When asked how to go about this, he suggested expanding birth control and abortion programs in developing countries. The world's top climate scientist, remember him? The top now, no one better, Dr. Rajendi Pachuri, says China has contributed significantly to the Earth's welfare by successfully curbing its population growth and energy and resource consumption. How's it done that? China's done that by, in part, its one-child policy and through forced abortions. Now remember Ted Turner. We showed you his quote before. We'd like to show you a clip from the interview that quote came from. You'll hear the quote again, but you'll hear more of what he says. It's taken from the Charlie Rose Show on PBS in 2008, so watch this.
Not doing it will be catastrophic. We'll have 8 degrees, we'll be 8 degrees hotter in 30 or 40 years, and basically none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Civilization will have broken down. What the few people who are left will be living in a failed state like Somalia or Sudan, and living conditions will be intolerable. The droughts will be so bad there'll be no more corn growing. Not doing it is suicide. Just like dropping bombs on each other, nuclear weapons is suicide. So we've got to stop doing the two suicidal things, which are hanging on to our nuclear weapons
and global
and then after that we've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there were
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff. But if there were less people, they'd be using less stuff.
They lay their argument out very well. We don't have to do this. You heard it right there from them. And he's just repeating the whole gospel. He's nobody special. Billions and billions and billions of dollars have been spent on abortion and contraception worldwide, not to improve people's health, but to reduce the number of people on the planet, or at this point at least to slow the rate of growth with the aim of reducing. You saw some of those quotes. We need to get less people, need to reduce the population. Wait until you see some of the other ones a little later in the show. The equivalent of entire populations have been killed through abortion, sterilization, and contraception. The rich and powerful, the influential of every stripe, have climbed in on the necessity of killing off or reducing large portions of humanity. That's what's going on here. We have a quote which is actually one of the most ridiculous quotes I think I've ever seen in my life. This is from Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Listen to this. If I were reincarnated, I would wish to be returned to Earth as a killer virus to lower human population levels. Royalty. He said that in front of the World Wildlife Fund a couple of years ago. Another one. I suspect that eradicating smallpox was wrong. It played an important part in balancing the ecosystem. That's John Davis, the editor of Earth First Journal. Here's another one. The big threat to the planet is people. There are too many. This guy's an environmentalist who's very well respected, Sir James Lovelock. Here's another great one. My three main goals would be to reduce human population to about 100 million worldwide, destroy the industrial infrastructure, and see wilderness returning. 100 million, shrink the world's population of roughly 6.5 billion now down to 100 million, and let all the cats and dogs and stuff take over. This guy is the co-founder of Earth First Journal. Here's another one. A total population of 250 to 300 million people, a 95% decline from present levels. That would be ideal. I wonder which side of the fence he'd include himself on. Here's another one. The resultant ideal sustainable population is hence more than 500 million, but less than 1 billion. That's produced from the Club of Rome under their document Goals for Mankind. There's different clubs and think tanks all over the world sitting around figuring out that you expel too much CO2 for their comfort level, and you have got to go. Here's another fun one. The extinction of the human species may not only be inevitable, but a good thing. These are the leading thought people in this movement, folks. These aren't like wackos hanging out, at the bar at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to explain how they're falling in their gin and tonic, how the world works. These people are well respected, they are published, they have all kinds of acclaim, honors wherever they go, they win Nobel Prizes, they get money, they get your tax money to fund this ridiculous stuff. This is what the whole global warming crowd is about. This one, which will disturb you, childbearing should be a punishable crime against society unless the parents hold a government license. Look where he's from. He's the first executive director of the Sierra Club. These are not people hanging out on the street who are wacko. Well, they're wacko, but these people occupy university chairs. They're funded by all kinds of money. Look at what they want to do. They're open about it. Every show we've done, any of you who've watched these CIA shows before, you know that we always find all of these agendas clearly written out. They're not hiding their agendas. It's all published. They know nobody reads, nobody does anything, they don't care, and they just say whatever they want, and they get away with it because nobody cares enough to find out and try to do something about it. Statements like this leave you dumbfounded with the depth of their stupidity. A government license to have a child. The real agenda of the population control crowd is to create a world with less people and better people. A utopia. Now, lest you think that this is not possible, oh, these are all crazy guys, yeah, they have government money, but something like this could never happen. What we uncovered in our research is a very small, very little known area of American history where science was the driving force behind a social agenda that promoted this very thing and was active in doing it. We're talking about the eugenics movement. Now, a lot of people think eugenics, oh, that's Hitler and the Jews in the camps. Oh, au contraire. No, it's not. Pay attention to this part of the show. Global warming is the natural evolution of the eugenics movement. Now, it is responsible. The thought process, the philosophy behind eugenics is what has given birth to climate change, to the climate change movement. The eugenics movement was an overt program aimed at reducing undesirables. Now, depending on which member of the eugenics program or person you may have been talking to, they might have had a different definition of undesirables, but you can rest assured that the definition never included themselves. Global warming is a covert program that is actually accomplishing much more than the eugenics program could ever have hoped to accomplish. Not only are undesirable third world populations targeted, but an overall worldwide reduction of the population is also in the offing. In this sense, global warming is the more sophisticated stepchild of the eugenics movement, employing many of the same tactics in fake science and mass hysteria and public relations campaigns, while also killing two birds with one stone. The elimination of undesirables, which includes not just a specific race or two, but lower income and middle class populations, and an overall reduction of the sheer number of humans. so that the remaining elites can enjoy the world's bountiful resources all to themselves. This sounds like fiction, doesn't it? Does this not sound like fiction? Look what global warming shares in common with the eugenics movement. Eugenics is accomplished through cleansing and control of the population. Now, while many people think the eugenics movement died after World War II, along with the Nazi regime, they're wrong. Originally, eugenics in America was primarily focused on all undesirable immigrants and those already living here. You're going, what are you talking about, eugenics in America? Eugenics in America. This movement started around the time slavery ended and immigration began to increase. What's significant here is the broad appeal of the eugenists in society, the broad appeal they made to science in order to sway public opinion in favor of cleansing the race. This is not fiction. While there were obvious racial overtones, of course, the movement was by no means limited to just a question of race. Books were published for general consumption, stressing the need to keep the race pure, all backed up by the latest science of the day, polls, everything. It was in popular culture, everywhere in popular culture. Got to keep the race pure, got to keep the race pure. In fact, in his famous 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald actually alludes to the spirit of the age. We've taken a clip to show you from the 1970s movie with Robert Redford and Mia Farrow. Watch this.
Nick, have you read that book, The Rise of the Colored Empires by Goddard?
Why, no.
Well, it's a fine book, and everyone ought to read it. See, the point is that if we don't watch out, the white race will be utterly submerged. No, that's so. It's up to us who are the dominant race to watch out, or these other races will have control of things.
We've got to beat them down.
Now, Daisy, it has all been scientifically proved. You see, we're Nordics. You are, and I am, and... Thank you. Excuse me. Anyway, we're responsible for all the things that have gone to make civilization. Art, science, and all that.
First time I saw that, I had no idea what they were talking about. After having researched this, I'm like, wow, that was really that wild. Now we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to go way into this eugenics movement and what happened in America. You're not going to believe what happened in this country as a result of this sort of science. We'll be right back right after this. Well, everyone, welcome back. Our CIA episode is Global Warming Unmasked, the Hidden Agenda. We're talking about what's really going on behind the global warming hysteria and hype. We're in this part of the show right now where we're talking about how the eugenics movement and the various tactics it used are now being employed by those who support global warming. Eugenics is and was about producing and maintaining a superior stock of humans. Scare tactics, hysteria, were employed to such a degree that pseudoscience saturated popular culture, as we just saw in that clip from The Great Gatsby, with fear that the country would become a race of mongrels and non-whites. Big, huge fears like this. Listen to the words of the United States Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. A United States Supreme Court justice held in extremely high regard wrote that in his 1927 opinion in a case called Buck versus Bell. In the United States, eugenics supporters included Theodore Roosevelt, the National Research Council, the National Academy of Sciences. I want to stop here for a second. The National Academy of Sciences is touted by the global warming movement as saying, oh, look, the National Academy of Sciences supports all this. The National Academy of Sciences 80 years ago also supported all of this garbage. Now, research was funded by distinguished philanthropies, prestigious universities, college and high school classrooms. All of this stuff was taught in various classrooms on all sorts of levels. In 1928 alone, eugenics was a topic, a course topic, in 376 separate college courses, with 20,000 students taking those courses as a regular routine. Can you imagine signing up for classes today? Well, I'm going to take philosophy and calculus and trigonometry and eugenics, but that's what happened. Margaret Sanger, we all know her, founded the American Birth Control League to urge the legalization of contraception for illegal immigrants and poor women. In its time, eugenics was touted by some as scientific and progressive. It was the natural application of knowledge about breeding applied to the arena of the human race. Well, we breed horses to get the best thoroughbreds. Let's do the same over here with humans and kill off the ones we don't like. Before the realization of the death camps in World War II, the idea that eugenics would lead to genocide simply wasn't even considered. It wasn't even taken seriously by the average American. Sterilization laws were put into place and programs in states all over the nation. It was the law that certain people had to be sterilized. Now, if you think this happened in like some small little place here or there, we've got some very scary graphics coming up for you. Starting in 1923, Oregon forcibly sterilized 2,648 people, including the mentally ill, criminals, epileptics, and homosexuals. And this state holds the dubious distinction of being one of 2 states that used castration as the form of sterilization. When did this end in Oregon? Well, I've never heard about that. The last sterilization was performed in 1978. But they weren't the only ones using these horrific practices. California was considered an epicenter of American eugenics. They sterilized 20,000 of their citizens, the state of California. By law, 1/3 of all sterilizations, as a matter of fact, performed in America happened in California. All in all, over 30 states enacted compulsory sterilization laws. Why don't you take a look at this map? 30 states enacted these laws. Look at this here. Pennsylvania, Indiana, California, Connecticut, Washington, Iowa, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, Kansas, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Oregon, South Dakota, Idaho, Alabama, Delaware, Montana, Virginia, Maine, Utah, Minnesota, Mississippi, Arizona, North Carolina, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Vermont, South Carolina, Georgia. Look at that map. Legal sterilization by law. 29 states enacted these laws before 1930, 4 after 1930. Look at that map. And don't think that ideas don't have consequences. Tens of thousands of Americans were sterilized against their will because rich elite people who pushed this stuff through different scientific academies and got their stamp of approval said, oh, this is how we have to regulate humanity. This was sanctioned by the U.S. government, the federal government. As a matter of fact, in the early 1900s, African Americans were they were targeted as a group to receive sterilization. Many were told if they did not surrender themselves to sterilization, they'd be stripped of their benefits, forced to abort unborn children, find new doctors, and other manipulative techniques to force sterilizations upon them. African American and other non-white men were spared time in jail if they agreed to be sterilized. The American Birth Control League, created in 1921 by Margaret Sanger, who is a well-known racist and an advocate for eugenics. She even began one program in the late 1920s aimed specifically at blacks called the Negro Project, and it was funded. With funding from John D. Rockefeller III, the American Birth Control League in 1942 became Planned Parenthood. Hitler did not originate the idea of eugenics and creating superior Aryan race. It was indeed an American concept. He saw this happening in America and went, aha, and grabbed it and incorporated it into his whole Nazi philosophy. He even received funding from the Rockefellers and the Carnegies to further his research and experiments. One of the places that got funded by the Rockefellers and the Carnegies was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany. It was all about sterilization and eugenics. Population control is not about race anymore. It's about survival of the fittest, about preserving and supporting a superior elitist class of human beings. Constant propaganda that we get today through commercial campaigns, movies, TV news, even clothing lines, are all informing us that our daily activities, such as driving to work, buying non-local produce, even breathing, are contributing to even increasing CO2 levels and greenhouse gases, which of course are destroying the atmosphere and killing Earth, and we're all going to die if we don't eat each other first. Through fear and guilt, we are being urged to take steps in reducing our carbon emissions. You even have a carbon footprint. Do you know that? You've been assigned a carbon footprint. You shouldn't produce this much more carbon CO2 gases than we think you should produce. The propaganda for this formula is very simple. Higher populations equal increased carbon emissions equal global warming. That's how it gets lined up. World politicians, scientists, philanthropists, climatologists alike are all crying for a decrease in population through population control in hopes of lowering and getting rid of the problem of global warming, a fake problem. The best way to reduce a person's carbon emission is to eliminate the person altogether. No person, no carbon footprint. A UN report entitled Women, Population, and Climate states that placing more women in the workforce is an important step to reducing global population. Instead of planning families, women will be more focused on their careers. Also stated in the disturbing report, if the needs for contraception and abortion are met in third world countries, over time, population control would happen naturally and would not have to be forced on the people. So let's disseminate as much contraception as we can, and the problem will kind of take care of itself. Optimum Population Trust. This is a UK organization that is offering services to people who support the green movement. So if you're in this group, you can donate money, and the group will use that money to go buy contraceptives and obtain abortions for women in third world countries like Africa and Haiti, and it will offset your carbon footprint by either not letting them be born or killing them. This is the goal of this movement. Ex-Vice President Al Gore stated in Copenhagen very recently that expanding birth control, family planning, and abortion programs in third world countries will help reduce the environmental threat. Many of these programs have been spread throughout the entire world, third world, through the UN, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all sorts of other institutions. The array of forces pushing this agenda, the money behind them, the influence is staggering. Now, you'll recall in the elections that just finished up in Kenya, as a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago at the time of this taping, that then Vice President Joe Biden went to Kenya and gave all kinds of speech and tipped his hat and made it very clear that if the Kenyan people voted in favor of that pro-abortion constitution, that all of this foreign aid would start flowing into their country. They voted in favor of it, and here comes the money. So Kenya now has legal abortion. The American eugenics movement used the hate and racism towards all undesirables to fuel and justify the start of their eugenics project. And they used science. They used science, not junk science. Everyone accepted this as the gospel. This science is irrefutable. They used this science to promote their fallacious arguments. What we have to understand is the elite now have moved on to a sort of new updated version of this, a new technique. It's not eugenics anymore. Now it's called global warming. The elite need global warming in order to pursue their reduction in population goals. That's what they're doing with this. They pay scientists and researchers in the top institutions to come up with models and reports and studies which back this claim and prove their theory to be correct. Now, we could do 10 episodes on this. You get the picture. I urge you, please, if you get this, please get this resource disc that comes with the set, plug it in, watch it, and start reading these reports, start reading these articles. What we've shown you is just the tip of the iceberg. It's crazy. It's crazy the amount of stuff going on. There are dozens and dozens and dozens, actually hundreds of articles and further research on that disc. So please, get it. It's included in the DVD packet. Now, very quickly to wrap up these last two, because this was the major one we wanted to focus on. The next dog in the fight in this global warming thing is governments. The desire on the part of governments to embroil themselves in this supposedly scientific fight over global warming is pretty simple. It boils down to power. It always boils down to power with government. That's all it's really ever about. Scenario goes like this. Our energy needs are largely fueled by fossil fuels. That's where we get our energy from, fossil fuels, burning coal, et cetera, et cetera. This action produces CO2 emissions. CO2 is causing global warming. Carbon dioxide emissions must therefore be reduced. You have to curtail the economy. You have to rein it in, shrink it down. This reduction must come about through government regulations because the cost to reduce carbon emissions is so expensive that businesses would never do it on their own. They're obviously always going to take whatever the cheapest route is to do it. So what government does is impose draconian limits, ridiculous limits on carbon emissions, and they give you hefty penalties for not following what the company's carbon footprint is. You have a carbon footprint, this company has a carbon footprint. You can't go over your carbon emissions here. Because this is why what the Supreme Court did in ruling that carbon, CO2 emissions, were a pollutant. That gave the government the carte blanche to go after companies, to say, reduce your, it's a pollutant. So the Supreme Court said so, it's a pollutant, reduce your emissions, and we have the control. Businesses, of course, to avoid the heavy fines, begin to cut their carbon emissions, which means they must develop alternative fuel sources, and that's what we mean by the green economy. It sounds so pleasant, doesn't it? Oh, the green economy will live in huts and have fans, and it's wonderful, and the waters will be pure, and the daffodils will grow, and there'll be no jobs. But these alternative fuel sources are not efficient, and they are prohibitively expensive. So business gets caught in the middle with much higher expenses, and guess who gets those expenses passed on to them? You. This is a hidden tax. All of this stuff is a hidden tax. A recent study by the Heritage Foundation, a very well-respected think tank, estimated that the cost of this carbon legislation for an average family of 4 would be $3,000 per year. And all of this stuff filters down to you, the customer. You can just take $3,000 off your take-home income right now and figure out how you're going to live. That's not an average cost, and it scales depending on how much money you make. Every family of 4, $3,000. What happens to your poor who can't get by now? You're about to charge them enough so they have to spend another $3,000 out of their pocket? This would cripple low-income families. And because of how the government would manage carbon emissions, it would exercise enormous control over the economy. You've heard of cap and trade, right? Everybody thinks, cap and trade. Nobody really understands exactly what it is. It's very simple. The government, acting as the almighty arbiter of energy, says, well, we can't have any more than X amount of CO2 emissions in the air. Based on that, we're going to assign to you, we're going to limit how much carbon emissions you can have, and you can have, and you can have. They give it to all the different companies. That's how it works. So they place a cap, a limit on what each company can emit. The cap is then sold to firms in the forms of emissions permits. Like you buy a coupon, and every month you let 1 million, whatever it is, pounds of carbon emissions into the air, you give up one of your permits until you're all done. Well, what happens if you run out of permits before the end of the year? Well, you simply go to another company and you buy their carbon emissions. Firms are required to hold a number of permits equivalent to their emissions. The total amount of the permits cannot exceed the cap, so that limits the total emissions that are, being expelled into the atmosphere. Firms, as we said, that need to increase their emission permits must buy those permits from the other companies that need to expel less carbon into the atmosphere. the transfer of a permit from big company here that needs more than the government says it can, from little company here that has extra, that's the trade. Cap and trade. That's how it works. And the government's the one determining this. In effect, the buyer is paying a charge for polluting with carbon dioxide, while the seller is being rewarded for having reduced emissions. The problem is that there is no cheap energy replacement source. There isn't. You can't do this. You can't run a factory producing cars with your wind turbines in the backyard. It's not going to happen. Cap and trade is nothing more than a convoluted energy tax, and again, it has to be a very high tax in order to reduce these emissions. Now, what many Americans don't know is this whole thing happened in Europe. This whole cap and trade thing happened in Europe. Of course, that's where we got the idea from, or the people who like to push this got the idea from. The Heritage Foundation did a study, and in that study they said the following. If there is any doubt about it, just look at Europe, which has had a cap and trade scheme in place for several years. That has been a failure in every way you look at it. It has not reduced emissions. It has not led to any technological breakthroughs that have reduced the need for fossil fuels. The reason is simple. For all of Europe's high-minded environmental rhetoric, the reality is that none of these nations wanted to bear the exorbitant cost of ratcheting down emissions. Cap and trade would cripple the economy. It would cost jobs, hurt the poor disproportionately, and deliver immense power into the hands of the government. Of course, the global warming leaders are on record about not caring too much about the economy. Listen to this quote. This is from the founder of the UN Environment Program, Maurice Strong. Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Your taxpayer dollars, by the way, go to support the UN. What the U.S. government gets with cap and trade and any other green legislation is virtually unlimited power to distribute energy to whomever it sees fit. If you're not exceeding your carbon emissions that have been established for you by Washington, then you get your energy. But if you exceed what Washington says is your limit, you can either be charged an exorbitant fine, or perhaps have your energy supply limited, or even cut off. Now, right now, the talk is about business. But if that gets in place with business, do you really think that wouldn't turn to individuals? If you think the government interfering in private lives to this extent is just based on junk science and the hysteria surrounding it just isn't possible, oh, please, the government could never do that. We'd never stand for it. Think back to the tens of thousands of citizens who were sterilized against their will by the government in state after state after state, in living memory of some people sitting here in this audience. And remember, the only thing that brought the eugenics movement to an end was the horror of the Nazi death camps. If that had not happened, sterilization would just be a normal thing. It was so revolting that finally the people said, oh, wait a minute, this whole theory is wrong. Government leaders were quite happy to just roll along, exercising power without limit over their citizens, federal and state. Remember that map. Very few states did not do this. So what happens to the poor of the world with this kind of energy legislation going on, the developing countries, if these types of policies get placed into effect and fall on them? Without the availability of fossil fuels for energy, their emerging economies simply don't stand a prayer. They need to build up their economies, they need to industrialize, create jobs, the same thing that happened in Europe in the 19th century, the same thing that happened here in the 20th century. This has to happen in the third world countries too to build up their economies. But the elite are insisting that the developing nations not use the same means of energy to lift themselves up from poverty that the industrialized nations did. It was this very issue, as a matter of fact, that was raised by developing nations like different developing nations in Africa and other places around the world. They started balking at all of this, and they raised a huge fuss at many of these international climate conferences saying, you know, that's fine, you want to do all this and keep the planet happy. We can't do this. We can't do this. You can't power a hospital on a wind turbine. It's not going to happen. The new energy technologies like solar power and wind turbines and biofuels, these all work. You sit on the Science Channel and you watch these. Oh, this is cool. Look, this family's living off their solar panels. Yeah, one family. but they don't produce enough energy to meet the massive demand of an economy. Hundreds of millions of people. There just isn't, this technology doesn't exist yet. And if it did, to meet this, it's prohibitively expensive. It's simply too expensive to produce this, which is why you don't see this. How many years, many of you here are a little older, how many years have you been hearing about, oh, the wind turbines and the solar panels? How come you don't see them? Because they're too expensive. They're too expensive. The global warming is caused by man, canard, is being used by forces operating through governments and various world governments as a power grab through taxation and fines. A new tax is being discussed, as a matter of fact, in various parliaments around the world. It's nicknamed a carbon tax. Yeah, you get to put this on your 1040s when you're doing your taxes in April. It's nicknamed a carbon tax. Here's the gist, very simple. People would be taxed based on their carbon output. So slow down your breathing rate. In Australia, for example, a professor at the University of Western Australia published an article in a medical journal saying the government should, get this, levy a $5,000 tax on every child over the government limit of 2, and then charge, on top of that, for every child an $800 annual carbon tax. Now, it didn't pass, but the fact is, while these and other positions like this, although it's extreme, that's crazy, it is these extreme positions that sort of, grease the skids, and the whole movement keeps moving that way. All new laws, yeah, they don't go all the way to the extreme. They move 3/4 of the way down the road. That's how all of these laws come into effect. Nonetheless, every kind of crazy idea that comes along, it got published. How many of you have had a crazy idea and then had it published in a scientific journal? Carbon taxes in general would have a devastating, a crippling impact on world economies. But a move is underfoot to do just that. Global warming scientists are talking up the idea of making up for our carbon footprints. It's called an offset. This is what it'd be a balance. So if you produce carbon over here, well, if you do something that reduces carbon somewhere else, we'll have kind of a carbon neutral thing going on. Sound goofy? Look at this. The Vatican got involved in this in 2007 when it agreed to have a forest planted in Hungary, which would absorb the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide that was produced by Vatican City each year. Here's a picture, for example, of a cardinal receiving the Vatican's carbon offset certificate in 2007. We're not making this stuff up, folks. As an aside, it turned out that the company that promised to plant the forest in Hungary to offset the carbon produced by the Vatican, it appears as though they actually swindled the Vatican. They took the money and then never planted the forest. But anyway, the larger point here is that these types of discussions are being had in very, very influential circles. Of course, the Vatican was praised up and down in the media for attempting to become Europe's first carbon neutral state. Too bad they don't praise them when we talk about trying to save unborn lives. And all of this is based on extremely questionable science. You can't even call this science. And the interpretation of this data that's collected. Agendas that have much, much more to do with social engineering than they have to do with scientific facts and a desire on the part of governments to greatly expand their power. That's what's going on here. Population reduction, governments. Now, one final point we need to mention, but we're not going to belabor it here, is the cheerleading that goes on for the global warming agenda from the Earth worship crowd. You wouldn't imagine that all the guys hugging trees and everything are also sitting over there in Harvard producing papers. Well, they're not. But they happen to have shared common goals here, as we said earlier in the show. While the Earth worship movement doesn't drive the agenda of legislation, it's still an area that can't be ignored from a philosophical point of view. Earth worshipers preach that the Earth itself is a living entity with an intelligence of its own, an actual living being. While they don't offer scientific evidence, because that's not their area, they don't care about offering scientific evidence, they do offer religious claims that this is a legitimate religion and should be treated like one. They even have a name for this earth god, or goddess, Gaia. Gaia is an old Greek goddess. In fact, one proponent of the earth is God theology is Sir James Lovelock, who wrote in his 2006 book, The Revenge of Gaia, he writes, Just as the human body uses a fever to fight off an infection, Gaia is raising her temperature to expel a harmful parasite, humans. On the current trajectory, the human population will be reduced to a few breeding pairs by the end of this century. How do you feel, fellow parasites? Feeling good today? Here's another thought provoker for you. It's from Robert Mueller, the former UN Assistant Secretary General. What an incredible planet in the universe this will be when we will be one human family living in justice, peace, love, and harmony with our, catch the word, divine earth, with each other and with the heavens. There are now even prayers to the earth. One line from one of the prayers goes just like this. On behalf of the human race, I ask forgiveness for having injured you. Forgive us, Mother Earth. That's from a student textbook on how to pray to the earth. And don't think this thought process is confined to the ravings of some esoteric tree huggers and witches and pagan worshipers. The following was said by Mikhail Gorbachev, head of Green Cross International. Nature is my God. To me, nature is sacred. Trees are my temples, and forests are my cathedrals. I want to begin to wrap things up here, but we still want to touch on a couple of points very briefly. First off, many of the Green parties, you hear about this a little bit in America, it's much more widespread in Europe, there's a reason for that. Many of the Green parties have deep, deep connections to the former communist regimes, because when the communist regimes collapsed at the beginning of the 1990s, late 80s and early 90s, those guys didn't just vaporize. They didn't just go off and start farming. They scattered, and they began to see that the Green Party, this green mentality, was a way to get government control and grab back their power. So many of these people went and invaded the Green parties and took over their leadership. Where did the former communists go? They didn't disappear. They went into the Green Party movement. At the very least, people who may not have been former communists share the same philosophical view that they should strive to create a utopia populated by only the very best human beings. Everybody else needs to go. Either kill them directly or sterilize their parents so that they don't reproduce. Now, again, we don't have time to build each of these cases with reams of detail, but I'm going to stress this to you again. We have got to know this stuff. We have got to know this stuff. And you raise it at your cocktail parties and when you're out with families and things. Talk about this stuff, because this is what's going on. So we need to get to that disc and read some information about it. We urge you to immerse yourself in this, really. I know it's horribly depressing, it's shocking, but this is, you got to know this stuff. Now, we're going to wrap up with this important point. The whole earth worship, global warming, climate change, government carbon tax, depopulation crowd has been actively working to enlist religions into their camp for a number of years now. They need to give their work sort of the air of respectability, and they seek to do that in part by co-opting religions in their program, in their great big scheme, in their movement. And of course, there's already some existing background. It's already there for them to begin to deal in this argument, in this area, and make the argument that, we should be good stewards of creation. We've all heard that. Of course we should be. No Catholic, no Christian, not other world religions, but certainly in the Judeo-Christian, nobody's going to say, no, don't be a good steward of creation. We don't have a responsibility. Of course we have a responsibility to take care of creation. But to this end, to co-opt religion into the plan, in 1990, Prince Philip, he of want to come back and be killer virus fame, said that a major goal of the Green movement was to get religious leaders involved so as to give the whole movement a spiritual imperative. The main point, however, is this. Religion places God first, while environmentalism places the earth first. There is a fundamental philosophical difference between environmentalism and religion. They have one small little overlay, and that's that religion recognizes creation needs to be protected. It does not elevate creation to the level of the divine, as we have heard. This should sound like the same old story, shouldn't it? Not much has changed since the garden, substituting creation in place of the Creator. Which is why the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops embracing this movement is raising considerable alarm, and it should. How deep are the U.S. Catholic bishops into this? For the past few years, they've been getting very deep in it, neck deep. In 2006, the USCCB launched the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change. That's a program designed to support the bishops' so-called environmental justice initiatives. Environmental justice. If you see that term, head for the hills. A whole curriculum, this is your money you throw in the collection basket. A whole curriculum was paid for and developed with your money and given to 19,000 Catholic schools all across America. I don't think they missed any one. If they did, it was pure accident. So that students could be instilled with and informed about global warming and climate change and what a horrible thing this is and how you have to reduce your carbon footprint. A couple of years later, they launched the Catholic Climate Covenant. This sort of pops up where people take an oath. They take an oath to help preserve the environment. Nicely called the St. Francis Pledge. Isn't that nice? Oh, it's very nice. I want you to hear the St. Francis Pledge. This is done by the bishops in the United States or their staff. I, or we, pledge to pray and reflect on the duty to care for God's creation and protect the poor and vulnerable. Learn about and educate others on the causes of moral dimensions of climate change. Moral dimensions of climate change. Assess how we, as individuals and in our families, parishes, and other affiliations, contribute to climate change by our own energy use, consumption, waste, etc. Act to change our choices and behaviors to reduce the ways we contribute to climate change. And advocate for Catholic principles and priorities in climate change discussions and decisions, especially as they impact those who are poor and vulnerable. See, you have to take an oath because this is all your fault. This is total propaganda. This is total propaganda. And it blindly accepts all of the nonsense put out by the climate change crowd as if it is proven fact. It isn't proven fact, and in many cases, it isn't even close to it. It's actually been disproven. Lots of this. But you wouldn't know that going to the USCCB. It's disingenuous to pass this off as though it's the truth and accepted Catholic teaching. This is even becoming established in Catholic liturgy, in Mass. A note went out of the office 2 years ago, suggesting that the homily for Sunday that coincided with Earth Day be a homily on climate change at Mass. The website for the CCCC has an area, that's the bishop's group, the environmental group, has an area for parishes where suggested petitions for Mass are provided. So here we are at the sacrifice of the Holy Mass, where we're praising God, involved in the sacrifice at Calvary, brought back to that. And what are you hearing from the pulpit? Well, here's one of the prayers. O Lord, help us to use our technological inventiveness to undo the damage we have done to your creation and to sustain your gift of nature. We pray to the Lord. At one point, the bishop's website gives a ringing endorsement, page after page, link after link, to where? Back to the IPCC, the UN group that's pushing all of this stuff, right there on the bishop's homepage. That's the controversial body, remember, that's pushing all this stuff and man-made global warming. There isn't the slightest reason to treat this as theological truth. In fact, since this is based on agenda-driven junk science, it's actually offensive to religious sensibilities because it's passing off as a truth something which is a lie or at best a mistake. You don't get to do this. What Pope Benedict said rings most true. He says, respecting the environment does not mean considering animal nature more important than man. It is important for assessments in this regard to be carried out prudently in dialogue with experts and people of wisdom. Catch this, uninhibited by ideological pressure to draw hasty conclusions. It is essential to sense that the earth is our common home and to choose the path of dialogue rather than the path of unilateral decisions. Our Holy Father said that 2 years ago at World Peace Day. In summary, as we step back and take a look at the great big picture here, what do we see? We see an enormous creature with many tentacles advancing various agendas like population control, earth worship, global governance, even animal rights. Now, to be sure, as we've said, each one has its own agenda, and each one, they kind of support each agenda under this global warming banner. But what they all absolutely share in common is what all movements and regimes opposed to eternal truths have in common. This quote from Peter Singer, who is the founder of animal rights, is a nice little summary. Christianity is our foe. If animal rights is to succeed, we must destroy the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. Now, given the intricate, decades-long unfolding and development of this whole movement, there can only be one source behind an evil which seeks to kill or limit the human race and to raise to the level of divine mere creation. Their ultimate leader is not Al Gore, it's not Mikhail Gorbachev, it's not Bill Gates, it's not the UN. These are ultimately, these and all of their followers are ultimately what Lenin used to call useful idiots. They are stooges for the enemy, who has since from the moment of creation sought to elevate creation above the Creator in the mind and heart of man. We know who that is. He's who the book of Revelation calls the one who deceives the whole world. No one can make the argument that the climate change movement in its current manifestation is anything but hostile to Christianity and Christian truths. When a movement of this size and this dimension and this degree of hostility to the faith becomes this powerful and influential, the faithful don't really need much more evidence. The hidden agenda here is easily recognized because it is the same agenda that it has always been. We know who is behind this movement. Look at the results. By their fruits, you will know them. God love you. Thank you for coming.